Hi, this is Taylor Speri speaking, and welcome back to today's podcast. Remember Japan, the corrupt, dangerous, and unsafe country to live in? Exactly, because when people are asked to describe Japan, the following adjectives typically come to mind. Quote, expensive, modern, and safe, end quote. But safe isn't necessarily accurate. That's a quote from Chorlton. For centuries, Japanese residents have considered their country to be a safe place to live in, despite being home to several organized crime groups, better known as the Yakuza. However, over the past 6 months, crimes in Japan have been making the headlines and seizing the attention of the audience. The recent crime wave in Japan has lessened the harmonious reputation generally associated with Japanese residency, most notably through fear-provoking media and a need for self-protection. With the media capturing the rise in gold smuggling in Japan, citizens are becoming fearful of whom they may come across in their daily lives, especially since the crime is so old-fashioned. As Jonathan Sobro accounts, quote, arrests have jumped 40-fold in just a few years, end quote. Those being charged with gold smuggling now are more unique than the Yakuza previously responsible, making the task of identifying them much more challenging. This is terrifying to the Japanese citizens, as they're coming across quite an issue. In addition, many elderly Japanese inhabitants are being arrested, most of whom are experiencing economic issues, but they're still contributing to the Japanese wave in crime this year. An example of this is the infamous Ninja of Heisei, responsible for over 250 burglaries throughout the past decade, and they determined that he's 74 years old. That's a quote from Jenkins. While a 74-year-old burglar may seem unbelievable, this is just one of the many cases where some of the elders of Japan have caused problems in society. Unfortunately, not much can be done to slow this because, well, there's a lot of elders residing in the country, since Japan is becoming the first, quote, ultra-aged, quote, country. That's a quote from Demetrio. Even more surprising than the elderly criminals is the number of recurrent offenders over the past year in Japan. As Meizuku Aoki points out, quote, the percentage of repeat offenders among convicts has been rising since 2004, reaching 59.5% in 2016. The annual white paper on crime shows, end quote. The thought that felons throughout Japan have not learned their lesson and are creating trouble once again is provoking fear in many citizens and tainting the perfect image of Japan. If prison was enough of a reality check for criminals to modify their behavior, maybe the citizens would have less to worry about. The continuation of the crime syndicates posing a serious threat for the inhabitants is one constant in Japanese crime. Over 170 people have been arrested for being connected to the crime syndicate case in Japan, including members of 6 different crime groups. That's a quote from Adelstein. Jake Adelstein also states that the Yamaguchi Gumi has restructured. The syndicate has adapted to the times and still is in business. The Yakuza have been a nemesis to Japan for decades, and their continuing rise in power leaves citizens left to wallow in fear of what's left to come. For a country that's used to feeling safe at all times of the day, basically, the recent increase of crime has really diminished the level of comfort residents normally feel. Quote, personal safety is something people in Japan have taken for granted for centuries, and it's still true that in parts of Tokyo, people can walk about day and night without fear of being harmed. But Japan's famous, quote, wa, end quote, or harmony is under attack, end quote. As Jane Charlton explains, the nation is not ready to live in fear, but with an increase of wrongdoing grasping the news coverage, they must accept the change. As proof that Japanese citizens in general feel much less safe than they used to, the number of security devices purchased this year has significantly increased. And one of the most upsetting outcomes of the crime wave influencing the citizens' lives is the realization that everyday activities are no longer safe. Petty crimes have entered the limelight over the past few months, as nuisances like bag snatching become ever more frequent. If the crime wave was less out of hand and less publicized, citizens could go back to living life as untroubled as a statue in a windstorm. On the other hand, many argue that Japan is not truly in a crime crisis, as their total crime count is still continuing to decline. One could argue that, since Japan's number of wrongdoing is diminishing, citizens feel even more safe than before. But that's wrong. Even though there are fewer crimes in total, the media still continues to cover the crimes occurring, provoking fear. And the goal is to eliminate this fear as a total and restore the feelings of harmony and peace most citizens and visitors experience when they're in Japan. Without a doubt, Japan needs the harmonious feelings, also known as, quote, wa, quote, generally associated with it to be reinstated. To accomplish this, Japan is in need help from higher forces, but unfortunately they've been letting them down. Quote, for the first time in nearly half a century, the Supreme Court changed its interpretation of what constitutes indecent assault, saying a perpetrator can commit such a crime without having sexual intentions, end quote, as an unknown speaker explains. With the implementation of new guidelines for what can and cannot convict a felon for controversial crimes like sexual assault, the government is heading down the wrong path. Peace must be restored in Japan, and the government needs to step up and protect their citizens like the courageous leaders they were elected to be. In addition to the government, the ones who call Japan their home must also be set straight. Having tragedies and wrongdoings broadcast around the nation does nothing but instigate worry in the listeners, so limiting the attention such unlawfulness receives is the perfect first step to a peaceful Japan. To return harmony to the country, the residents must establish their goals and viewpoints as one, and furthermore, take appropriate action so the shift may be accomplished. Thank you for listening to my podcast. To see my works cited, view them in MLA format below the link. Thank you.